Henry VIII's gluttony was not merely a royal indulgence, it was a grotesque descent into self-destruction. How did the most powerful monarch in England become a prisoner to his own putrid cravings, eating himself toward death? This tale of excess, illness, and decay exposes the dark underbelly of a king whose diet sealed his fate. Get ready to uncover how Henry's horrifying eating habits brought about the ruin of a dynasty and the suffering of a man once revered as a god. At the pinnacle of Tudor England's power, Henry VIII stood as a titan of ambition, strength, and authoritarian emperor in a kingdom hungry for dominance. Born in 1520, Henry inherited a realm brimming with promise, poised on the cusp of shaping Western history. His early reign was characterized by vigor, athletic prowess, and a healthy appetite that matched his towering stature. Standing over 6 feet tall with commanding presence, he was a figure who seemed impervious to weakness. Beneath his regal exterior, however, lay hidden seeds of a downfall wrought not by sword or betrayal, but by an insidious appetite. Henry's lineage was noteworthy not for hereditary disease, but for royal rivalries and the crushing weight of expectations. His father, Henry VII, had ascended amid civil wars, binding secularity and monarchy tighter than ever. Yet, Henry VIII was destined to rewrite the weaknesses of his line. His unmatched physical strength early in life made him a paragon of masculine ideals. His love for jousting, hunting, and feasting only reinforced his image as an indomitable ruler. Yet the very acts that celebrated his vitality sowed the discordant threads of decay. The grandeur of his court was mirrored by excesses that defied moderation. Lavish banquets featured mountains of roasted meats, exotic pies stuffed with birds within birds, and goblets overflowing with wine and ale. His culinary desires were legendary, more a gluttonous indulgence than a royal necessity. Cooks were commanded to prepare vast quantities of rich, fatty foods seasoned heavily with sugar, a costly ingredient then reserved for the elite. The king's diet heavily favored red meats, buttery pastries, and confectionaries, often consumed in quantities that defied sense. This was no mere appetite, but an obsession drawing from deeper psychological wells. But even as the king indulged his hunger, whispers circulated about the enormity of his size, foreshadowing the troubles to come. His weight ballooned as the years pressed on, his once powerful frame succumbing to layers of flesh that encumbered movement and health. The physical transformation was a symbol of something darker, gluttony as an agent of doom. The seeds were planted when Henry, at his most commanding, began to embrace a lifestyle that would not just slow him down, but undermine his very existence. Behind the gilded throne, the royal court was a theater of intrigue and secrets. Henry's physical prowess was admired, but the warning signs of deterioration were visible to those near him. His dependence on food grew in tandem with political tensions. The splendor of his reign masked a troubling paradox, a leader whose strength was increasingly a fad over an internal rot. Yet none could foresee how horrifying the consequences would be. As the powerful monarch remained preoccupied with his ambitions, the rotting core of his health expanded quietly, like a hidden plague ready to explode. Henry's flawed diet, a grotesque mixture of overindulgence and unbalanced nutrition, was more than a personal failing. It was the harbinger of an empire's unraveling. How did his excess translate into tragedy? How could a man so mighty be undone by his own cravings? These questions loomed over the Tudor court, demanding answers that many feared to confront. As the foundation of Henry's reign steadily crumbled beneath layers of meat and sugar, the catastrophe was nearer than anyone dared imagine. Will you join us to discover the moment the mighty fell? To witness how the seeds of doom in Henry's sumptuous lifestyle began to bloom into ruin. Before Henry's collapse, his kingdom stood resolute, but the clock of his demise had begun ticking. One bite at a time, the king's glorious reign was inching towards a horrific end. If you thirst to unravel the morbid chronicles behind royal power and decay, subscribe now and tell us, what excess do you think first did Henry in his ambition or his appetite? The turning point in Henry VII's descent from regal health to harrowing decay came suddenly, yet with terrifying subtlety, a gruesome accident that introduced the unhealable blight on his body. In February of 1536, Henry was engaged in a brutal jousting tournament, a favorite sport that affirmed his kingly masculinity and prowess. During a fierce tilt against the Duke of Norfolk, Henry was struck directly in the leg by a weapon, severely injuring his left thigh. The blow shattered the bone, sending shards piercing into the surrounding muscle and breaking the skin to an alarming extent. This injury, although initially treated by the best physicians of his age, marked the unrelenting beginning of a physical decline that would scar both the body and spirit of the monarch. The official records painted a stoic image of the king, confident and unyielding despite the agony. Yet behind closed doors, the stark reality was far grimmer. Henry's wound festered in the cold, damp castle chambers, immune to the feeble remedies of the time. Infection set in quickly, with gangrenous decay, foul odors, and swelling, turning his thigh into a hotbed of rot. The pain was unimaginable, restraining the once vigorous king to his bed for weeks. Henry's court, desperate not to reveal vulnerability to foreign spies or internal plotters, maintained strict secrecy regarding his condition. The king's closest advisers enforced isolation, allowing only a select few to witness the true extent of his suffering. Courtiers whispered rumors of an unspecified illness, but none dared to challenge the official narratives. This secrecy doubled the horror, as it masked a lethal decline behind a flickering facade of royal strength. Furthermore, Henry's personal suffering grew darker as his injury refused to heal across the months. His lifestyle did not improve the situation. Though confined, he continued consuming prodigious quantities of rich, fatty foods, wine, and sweet delicacies, far beyond the needs of a sedentary, wounded man. This gluttony accompanied his physical pain, as if an attempt to soothe his torment with excess, an impulse as dangerous as it was destructive. Compounding his affliction was the initial inability of Tudor medical science to properly treat such wounds. Surgeons lacked effective antiseptics or knowledge of bacterial infection. Amputations were viewed as a last, desperate resort, and in the case of a monarch, a risky blow to legitimacy and morale. Instead, treatments revolved around bloodletting, poultices made from herbs and animal fats, and crude cauterizations that often worsened the pain. During this period, Henry's mental state also began to shift. Once vibrant and engaged, he became irritable, withdrawn, and prone to emotional outbursts. The king's mood swings destabilized relationships within the court, adding political tension to his physical misery. Secrecy helped contain public awareness, but court insiders grew anxious as the king's mobility deteriorated. Henry was confined to his chambers for much of the year following the accident. Footmen and nurses had to assist his every movement. His guards noted a smell of decay, sometimes nauseating, exuding from the bandaging on his leg. Foul pus seeped through makeshift dressings, prompting desperate attempts at hygiene within the primitive system available. Watching a once paragon of Tudor, might gutted by this creeping rot, created a chilling atmosphere around the throne. Yet, despite the ominous signs, Henry remained stubbornly defiant. His desire to resume normal functions drove him to ignore medical advice, often participating late into night in council meetings or even secret affairs. The dichotomy between his royal image and physical fragility grew more pronounced daily. The injury was no longer just a wound, had become a manifestation of his mortal limits. Friends and foes alike waited with bated breath for the inevitable collapse, unsure if the king's vitality would survive what many called a living death of flesh and spirit. How long could Henry hide his secret? What fate awaited his kingdom as monarch and flesh rotted beneath weighty expectation? Each passing day tightened the noose around the Tudor legacy, spinning a web of suspense and dread deeper than ever before. The question remained, would the king fall to his injury, or would his empire crumble under the strain of his secret affliction? The secrets and suffering of Henry VIII were far from over. As Henry VIII's physical condition worsened, the consequences rippled far beyond the confines of his chambers, infecting the very core of English politics and destabilizing an empire teetering on the edge. The debilitating injury, which had turned his leg into a festering rot, mirrored the fracturing of his kingdom's foundations. The king who once charged into battle and led his armies was now a man trapped by his own failing body, vulnerable to internal dissent and external threat. His incapacity dramatically impaired England's military ambitions. Wars against France and Scotland, already fraught with risk, suffered from his slowed decision-making and absence from the field. Military generals found their commands hindered by conflicting directives, as Henry's intermittent engagement bred confusion and lack of unified strategy. In 1544 and 1545, the wars dragged on longer and costlier than they should have, resulting in significant resource exhaustion and diminished morale across the ranks. The king's personal health crisis became a symbol of national weakness, emboldening rival powers to exploit England's vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, the scandalous disruptions to Henry's personal life further destabilized the political landscape. His inability to produce a stable male heir weighed heavily on the future of the Tudor dynasty. The king's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had failed to bear a surviving son, prompting Henry's infamous quest for annulment to marry Anne Boleyn. The political upheaval from these marital entanglements, English Reformation, and break from Rome's shockwaves through Europe and strained internal governance. Yet, Henry's growing corpulence and leg affliction gradually sapped his energy, making renewed quests for heirs and affirmations of power more desperate and erratic. The king's infamous temper flared with greater frequency, often blaming the court or his advisors for setbacks. Intrigue and factionalism flourished as courtiers jockeyed to curry favor with a monarch increasingly prone to paranoia. Some plots to depose or manipulate him simmered beneath the surface. Without a vigorous ruler to tightly hold the reins, the Tudor court devolved into a boiling pot of suspicion and rivalry. Parliament's demands for reform clashed with Henry's erratic decrees and medical incapacity. Foreign emissaries noted the king's declining appearance during crucial negotiations, interpreting it as a sign of weakness. The king's physical rot seemed to symbolize political rot, decaying authority, fractious rule, and uncertain succession. Henry's diet, luxuriously excessive but nutritionally deficient, accelerated this decline. His obesity intensified his leg ulcers. Poor circulation and diabetes, possibly exacerbated by his eating, guaranteed the wounds resisted healing. His sedentary lifestyle, forced by injury, became a vicious cycle of weight gain and worsening ailments. Despite clear signs of failing health, the king's vain insistence on grandeur prevented meaningful change. Advisors noted how his body betrayed his mind's fierce will, heightening tensions at court. Secret conversations hinted that the empire's fate indeed hung on the king's fragile frame. What if Henry dropped dead without a male heir? The realm would explode in civil war and chaos. His enemies abroad lurked, awaiting an opportune moment to strike. The sense of impending disaster grew by the year, the king's grotesque physical state a battered monument to a brittle reign. Attempts to address these political crises were hampered by the king's physical limitations. Large councils became difficult, and Henry delegated powers irregularly, sometimes to dangerous effect. Unexpected decisions like the execution of trusted officials fueled cyclical purges that weakened governance. His leg's terrible wounds, oozing and emitting foul odors, became the grim emblem of a monarch whose body and empire rotted side by side nearly inseparable. The course was set. Henry VIII would be a ruler consumed by his own failures of flesh and empire. Would he find a way to reclaim his throne and health, or would his suffering spiral into an irreversible catastrophe? The kingdom waited, fearful and uncertain, for answers that only the tortuous months ahead could provide. The agony that marked Henry VIII's final years defied description, a torment weaving together unbearable pain, putrid decay, and crushing isolation. His flesh betrayed him so thoroughly that the king's suffering became a public spectacle, cloaked in polite silence, but whispered with horror in hushed corners of the court. The leg wound that had haunted him since the jousting accident turned into a festering, nightmare necrotic flesh blackening the skin, swollen beyond recognition and producing copious amounts of foul, greenish pus with an odor so vile it sickened attendants. Pain racked his nights, waking him in sweat-drenched torment. He was often immobilized, forced into reclining chairs and confined to bed, each movement agony as broken bone fragments pressed against raw flesh. This rot infected surrounding tissue, generating ulcers that erupted, scabbed, and bled freely. Perspiration mingled with wounds, causing bandages to adhere painfully to his skin. The king's once proud figure was now bloated beyond all dignity, swollen limbs leaking fluids, and stained with grime despite continuous care. His legs developed massive calluses, and repeated infections spread threatening gangrene further up the limb. Breathlessly, historians have painted this grim image with clinical detachment, yet no chronicler could deny the horror. This was more than physical decay, it was the crushing weight of mortality pounding at the gates of a man who fancied himself immortal. The king's emotional and psychological torments matched his physical pain. His narcissism and temper became brittle, erupting in fits of rage over minor frustrations. At times his mind dulled, slipping into depressive stupors. The isolation was profound. Many attendants kept their distance for fear of infection or disgust. Only a handful of trusted servants remained, nursing him with grim determination. The king's bedchamber grew ever more somber, heavy with the stench of sickness and the silence of impending death. Public appearances were few and staged, but were inevitable and always dreaded. On one such occasion during the Christmas celebrations of 1546, Henry appeared grotesquely overweight, barely able to stand, his leg propped on cushions and concealed beneath elaborate robes. Courtiers bowed, but looked on with a mixture of pity and revulsion. The king's dignity was all but gone. A climax of his medical nightmare came when his leg complexion changed drastically, and a severe infection near his thigh caused a fever so high it nearly ended his life. The court was plunged into chaos. Doctors attempted soothing baths and hot compresses, but the king's body rebelled. His vital signs fluctuated wildly. He was close to septic shock. The shock waves of his near-death experience sent his ministers into panic. Were they about to lose the monarch who held the fragile state together? Negotiations with rival nations stalled, and the country braced for chaos. Attempts to perform amputation had been refused by Henry, who viewed it with the horror of a condemned man confronting his own execution. The kingship itself hinged on his survival, but the physical horror raged unchecked beneath royal robes. Even the most loyal courtiers found themselves appalled by the increasingly grotesque spectacle. Each hour stretched into a nightmare of dripping bandages, screams muffled within walls, and a king trapped within a body turned hostile. The question remained darker still. How far could his body decay before Henry VIII was finally claimed by death? Would the legacy of this tortured monarch be one of glory or grotesque ruin? The deadly spiral of the king's health had reached its crescendo, and those who witnessed it quietly awaited the catastrophic aftermath, hidden behind closed, decaying doors. In the desperate quest to salvage Henry VIII from the clutches of his fetid wounds and crippling illness, Tudor doctors and alchemists resorted to a grim arsenal of treatments blending medieval superstition, primitive science, and horrifying experimentation. The medical knowledge of the 16th century was painfully limited, and physicians faced a baffling, relentless infection that no known remedy could halt. Almost no procedure escaped being touched by a macabre blend of hope and brutality. The most common treatment began with bloodletting, believed to balance the humors and stop disease. Using rudimentary lancets, surgeons drained the king's blood in fury, hoping to cut off inflammation and infection. This practice, rather than healing, often left Henry feeling weak, dizzy, and more vulnerable to fever. Lancing abscesses was another rough method. The king's physicians would pierce swollen pockets of pus with crude blades, releasing the toxic fluids, but also opening the way for further contamination. The procedures were excruciatingly painful, performed without anesthesia or antiseptics. The grotesque odors that filled the room were a constant reminder of decay. Beyond surgical attempts, the alchemists concocted potions and salves, combining herbs, animal fats, and minerals. Recipes included mixtures like mercury ointments, known today for their toxicity, applied heavily to the ulcers. Poultices made from moss, figs, or even pigeon dung were spread over wounds in hopes of drawing out infection, a practice as repellent as it was futile. One of the most bizarre treatments involved applying leeches to drain bad blood, an ancient method that was ineffectual against Henry's wounds, but persisted due to tradition. Doctors also used cauterization burning flesh near ulcers with hot iron sin, an effort to stop the spread of necrosis. These practices only added layers of agony. The king himself was involved in the treatment choices, insisting on regimens that promised relief or miracle cures, often against his doctor's advice. Their recommendations frequently clashed with Henry's temperament and desperation. At times, doctors sought to control the king's appetite, understanding that gluttony contributed to his worsening condition. However, Henry's indulgent nature and the political need to maintain the appearance of divine right made any dietary restrictions difficult to enforce. Yet the king's unchecked craving for rich meats, sugary desserts, and heavy wines only accelerated his decline, promoting obesity, diminishing circulation to his leg, and worsening diabetes symptoms. The medical community surrounding Henry VIII was caught between advancing Renaissance ideals and deeply entrenched medieval beliefs. Some physicians advocated for more rational approaches to diet and care, but most were hamstrung by lack of true knowledge or fear of offending royal authority. Observers noted the grim paradox. Treatments intended to heal often multiplied suffering. The king's life was prolonged, but at a cost severe pain, accentuated infections, and the looming shadow of death. Political advisors and courtiers grew increasingly desperate as Henry's capacity to rule waned. Some whispered of poisoning or necromantic curses, unable to comprehend the brutal reality of medical ignorance. Rival factions debated the viability of replacing the failing king, fearing civil strife. The paradox deepened monarch's suffering, was a state secret and a source of public anxiety. His grotesque condition delicately concealed while the kingdom teetered. As Henry's body became a canvas for dark science and cruel hope, the end seemed unavoidable. His grotesque diet, medical torture, and stubborn will clashed fatally, producing a tragic spectacle of a king slowly devoured by his own excesses. What would become of a man who once shaped history, but could not conquer his own flesh? What horrors still awaited in the final act of this extraordinary downfall? If these grim truths captivate your morbid curiosity, subscribe for more tales from history's darkest corners, and tell us, would you have obeyed a king whose meals were murder on his own body? Henry VIII's death in 1547 was as harrowing and grotesque as his final years, a messy culmination of decades of self-destruction, flesh wasting away beneath layers of indulgence and infection. He passed away in his private apartments at Whitehall Palace, weighed down by at least 400 pounds and crippled by a chronic open wound on his leg that had refused all healing. Reports from contemporaries describe a macabre scene. The king, bedridden and unwashed for prolonged periods, surrounded by servants struggling with the stench of rot and decay that permeated his chambers. His body was described as bloated, discolored, and foul-smelling, a stark contrast to the regal image that once commanded kingdoms. The leg wound itself, blackened and ulcerated, was a source of unrelenting pain until the very end. After his death, a choreographed sequence of mourning unfolded. His kissing coffin lay in state for days, but even mourners struggled to mask the stench of advanced necrosis that radiated from his remains. The embalming process was rudimentary and unable to stem the odor or preserve appearance. The king's burial in St. George's Chapel at Windsor was marked by the tragic irony of grandeur and decay intertwined. His tomb would become a morbid monument to the toll of flesh corrupted by excess. Politically, Henry's death left England at a crossroads. His 9-year-old son, Edward VI, succeeded him, a weak boy whose short reign could not prevent the turmoil ensuing from conflicting religious and factional ambitions. The Tudor dynasty, born of Henry's ambitions, was immediately threatened by unrest and succession crisis. Modern science has shed terrifying light on the precise nature of Henry's ailments. Analysis of remains and historical records suggest he suffered from type 2 diabetes exacerbated by morbid obesity and poor circulation, a lethal trio that impedes wound healing and can cause gangrene. The injury he sustained in the jousting accident likely became a chronic ulcer infected with bacteria causing necrosis and persistent inflammation. His excessive consumption of red meats, sugar, and alcohol accelerated insulin resistance and vascular damage, effectively sealing his fate. Additionally, it is believed Henry suffered from possibly severe septic arthritis in the leg joint, a condition that today would require antibiotics and surgery, but then meant slow, painful decay. His psychological state evidenced depression and likely chronic pain syndrome, contributing to his over-reliance on food and worsening health. Had modern medicine been available, interventions such as blood sugar management, antibiotics, amputation, and advanced wound care might have spared his suffering. Instead, Henry's story stands as a grotesque warning of how unchecked gluttony and medical ignorance can turn a mighty king into a tragic figure destroyed by his own excesses. The disgusting diet of Henry VIII was not merely a scandalous indulgence, it was a venomous poison that corroded flesh and doomed a dynasty. The king who ate till death left behind a legacy drenched in power, pride, and the horrifying costs of human frailty. Would Tudor England have survived had Henry been spared this cruel fate? We may never truly know, but the bones and scars tell their stark tale. The question now lingers: how many other rulers have been devoured by their own appetites, hiding painful secrets beneath crowns and cuirasses? If the morbid depths of history enthrall you, subscribe to explore more chilling stories and share. What royal excess do you think has been most deadly throughout history?